Hello everyone and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero, your AI host. Today we're going to continue showcasing the sessions I played in August. August was one of the slowest poker months of the year. The World Series had recently completed, so visitors who came for the series were slowly receding back to whatever corners of the world they came from. There were a few sessions I played where I arrived at my usual vampiric hours, only to discover there was only one short-handed table remaining for 2-5 in the entire casino, and it was usually dominated by familiar faces, so I ended up leaving early after only an hour or two. With the help of my new editor, whose name also happens to be Josh, we're quickly jamming through my backlog of vlogs since we're bringing you 2 vlogs per week now, so before long we're going to be catching up to present day. I'm going to be recording coaching sessions with my new acolyte, so that series will be available on my Patreon for anyone who's interested. Today I'm going to cover 2 different sessions. The first takes place on Monday, August 12th at 11:08 p.m. at night. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for $1,500, which is 300 big blinds. 8 minutes into the session, we're 6-handed. Under the gun limps. +1 raises to 20. I look down at 8-9 of diamonds in the big blind. This is actually a great candidate to occasionally 3-bet in position when you're playing deep stack, but here, since I'm out of position, I just call. Under the gun calls as well, so we go 3-handed to a flop of ace, 9, 10, rainbow with 1 diamond. We flop bottom pair with a few different backdoor draws. So of course, I check. Under the gun checks as well. The OG raiser c-bets for 45, which is a pretty strong 3/4 pot size bet. This isn't exactly telling though, since he has position, he knows that an ace-high board is good for his range, and we're also short-handed. So I make the call, but the under the gun folds. The turn is a 6 of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. We now have a gut shot draw to go along with our pair. I check with intentions of check raising, since this runout is very good for our defending range in the big blind, but our opponent checks the action back. Maybe I don't need to steal this pot after all. There's a good chance I might actually have the best hand here, given how the action went on the turn. So when the river brings in an inconsequential deuce of spades, the action gets checked around. I table my hand, and it's good. An $80 win after flopping bottom pair on an ace-high board ain't bad. Nothing exciting happens for the next 50 minutes. Our old table has broken, so we've been moved to a new full-handed table where the straddle is on permanently. So we're essentially playing 2-5-10. Straddling as an option is a bad idea. However, if the whole table is doing it, this is actually a really good thing for a pro. It allows us to play bigger limit with players who are normally uncomfortable with these stakes. The player pool is going to be way better than if you simply sat down to a 5-10 table. For this hand, the button limps. The small blind folds. I raise to 55 in the big blind with pocket 10s. The straddle folds, but the button calls. So we go heads up out of position to a flop of 9, 6, 4 with 2 diamonds. This is a great flop for pocket 10s. I start with a half pot c-bet of 65. My opponent makes the call with about 700 behind. The turn is a queen of spades, putting 2 spades to go along with the 2 diamonds. I'm not a huge fan of the turn, but I'm not terrified of it either. My opponent holding a queen here would be pretty random unless he has a diamond flush draw that contains a queen, in which case I'm royally screwed. I lead for another 40% pot bet of 100. This will incentivize a naked 9 to continue. Either flush draw will definitely call, but any hand that has us beat will most likely raise here due to the sizing I chose. We don't want to bet too large here and allow any hand that's dominating us to continue trapping. If I face a raise here, it's just an easy laydown. Thankfully, my opponent folds, so we take down another small pot. Up $304 just over an hour into the session. Less than 10 minutes later, I get dealt the exact same hand, same suits and everything. I open to 50 in the low jack. The action folds around to the small blind, who suddenly 3-bets me to a staggering $225. He's sitting there with a full stack of $1,500. The action quickly folds back to me. That price point will not allow us to profitably set mine. I'm only ever going to call here if I think I'm ahead. However, my superpower is about to kick in.
My spider sense is tingling.
Can anyone tell me why I think I'm ahead here? Take a moment to think about it. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, so I opened to 50, right? No one called. There are no limpers in this hand. It's just me, the blinds, and the straddle. If the small blind were to 3-bet any amount here, the big blind and straddle will be trapped between 2 aggressors with nothing invested, so they're going to be folding the vast majority of their hands here. So why choose an amount that's so large? The very last hand, when this exact same opponent was in the big blind, another guy opened to 45. He got 1 caller. That was when this opponent 3-bet to 225, which is the same amount he chose this time. Under those circumstances, I could warrant a big raise. I think he had an actual made hand that time. Now, I'm putting him on an exact hand. I'm putting him on exactly ace-king.
I've got you in my sights.
He's high on the fact that he just got dealt 2 big hands in a row, so he probably thinks it's funny to choose the same 3-bet amount. The problem with that is his current opponent is extremely adept at the psychology behind this game. I make the call. I don't care if this flop brings a jack or a queen and my opponent barrels all 3 streets. I'm going to call him down as long as there's no ace or king in the run out. So the flop comes, and we hit a freaking set. Except, it's not exactly the one we wanted to hit. It's 10 jack queen rainbow. This is a nightmare scenario. My opponent leads for another half pot bet of 225. Many amateurs will raise here with my hand, and then most likely commit their stack since the pot will be too big at this point. Me? Yes, I just flopped a freaking set. However, pre-flop, I put my opponent on an exact hand. If I'm right, he just flopped the shite out of this flop with the nuts. Why the heck would I ever raise here? Think about it logically. This is a nightmare flop for aces and kings. Every smaller pair just made a set, and ace-king just flopped the nuts. Aces and kings sure as heck wouldn't start this flop with such a huge c-bet. They would most likely check. There's a good chance that even jacks or queens would likely check this flop back, or at least bet small, since they'd be afraid that I'm the one that's holding ace-king. So what kind of hand bets so strong? Ace-king would. Nothing has changed with regards to the hand holding I'm putting my opponent on. The major difference is that I know what my opponent has, but he has no idea what I have. So I make the call, praying for a board pair. The turn comes, and it's a gorgeous queen of clubs. Oh baby, baby, how you doing?
How you doing?
So when my opponent shoves all in, I snap call. The run out of a 6 of spades doesn't really matter because I suspect he's drawing dead. Surely enough, he tables ace-king, and I show him the bad news. We scoop a massive pot to be up $1,810 only an hour and 8 minutes into the session. The rest of the night goes by pretty slow. This next hand happens an hour and 20 minutes after the last big hand we played. The straddle is still on as usual, except we're down to only 6 players. Here, I open to 25 in the hijack with ace-10 offsuit, which is only a 2.5x open. The cutoff calls. The button 3-bets to 75 with 900 behind. This particular opponent had been 3-betting me often, and always in position. The sizing he chose here is just a bit too weak. He's only raising my bet by 3x, even though there's an opponent between us. You can get a lot of information based on a person's bet and raise amounts. These are known as sizing tells, and it's exactly how I knew my last opponent had ace-king. You need to be very careful with your bet amount so that you don't telegraph your hand. This is why I often reiterate that bet sizing and hand selection are the 2 biggest problems for recreational players. So here, I chose to take a stand and risk my stack based on my read. I 4-bet to 325 with a hand that's barely worth limping in. Thankfully, both of my opponents quickly fold, so I take down the trapped $100 without seeing a flop. For the last hand of the night, I have jack-queen of spades in the big blind. +1 limps for $10. The middle position raises to 35. Again, I have a hand that's a great candidate to 3-bet, but since I'm out of position, I just make the call. The +1 calls as well. The flop comes 5, 5, 9, rainbow. The action checks around. The turn is a jack of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. I'm a huge fan of this card, but since I'm out of position, I choose to check again. The action checks around to the OG raiser, who puts in a bet of 75. I'm not completely positive that I'm good, so a check raise would be suicidal. So I just make the call, and the +1 gets out of the way. The river is an insignificant deuce of hearts. I check again, with plans of calling any pot-size bet. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. I table my hand, and it's good. My opponent shows that he was also betting with a jack. Shortly after this hand, I rack up and leave for the night. Even though the last 2 hands I showed were small wins, there were many small losses that I didn't bother showing in the last several hours. In for $1,500 and out for $30.76 for a profit of $1,576 after 3 hours and 53 minutes of playtime. As you can see from my graph, my whole night was made from just 1 hand. This is actually pretty typical for my sessions. It all boils down to playing just a few hands either well or poorly. That's why you really need to concentrate on limiting your mistakes. Before we move on to the next session, I'd like to request that you take a moment to hit that like button. Only about half of my viewers are subscribed to the channel. If you aren't already, please consider taking a moment to subscribe to my channel. I'll show you free tips and tricks on how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em. I do offer one-on-one coaching for anyone interested. I can do these in person if you're local to Las Vegas, or via video chat if you're not. You can find my rates on my Patreon page, as well as some modest subscription rates if you just want to help the channel out. This takes us to our next session for this video. As usual, we're playing 2-5 no limit hold'em at the Win Encore in Las Vegas, where I bind for $1,500, which is 300 big blinds. It's Saturday night, although technically Sunday morning, August 25th. We start the session at 1:51 a.m. in the morning. We don't get anything for the first hour. I'm down $70 from just bleeding off small hands. Here, under the gun opens for 15. I had 3-bet to 50 in the +1 with the not-so-jiggities. Everyone folds to the original raiser, who 4-bets me to 165 with a full stack of 1500. We're getting the right odds to set mine if we're behind. We're also in position, so I make the call. The flop comes 5, 10, 2, with 2 clubs and 1 spade. My opponent checks. Here, I probably take the betting lead maybe about 80% of the time, since I have an overpair to the board that's unlikely to improve. I'm beating all ace-x type of hands, and would like to deny equity to random overcards. However, once in a while, I like to keep the pot manageable, with a deceptively strong hand in case my opponent is also pot controlling with a bigger overpair. It also allows him some rope to steal the pot in case the board doesn't change, since I have position. So this is one of the rare times where I decide to check the action back. Unfortunately, my decision backfires when a king of clubs peels on the turn. This is definitely a card that changes the dynamic of the board. Right on cue, my opponent comes out firing for 125, which is slightly over a third pot bet. He might have a king, or he might have ace-queen offsuit with the ace of clubs. If he has a king, unless it's also accompanied by the ace of clubs, I do have a jack of clubs redraw. And this price is just too small to fold to, so I make the call. The river breaks out with a 7 of diamonds. Suddenly, my opponent continues firing, but for a substantially larger bet in proportion to the pot in the form of $350. I lose to pocket tens, pocket kings, pocket aces, ace-king, the front door flush. I'm pretty much only beating exactly ace-queen offsuit here. I've never played against this opponent before, so I decide to make the fold. For this next hand, the cutoff posts his missing blinds, the low jack limps. Once in a while, with callers in front, I like to limp with garbage hands like the one I'm about to limp with here in the hijack. We're talking about 7-9 offsuit. I don't make this play too often, but I mix it in now and again to fool my opponents into thinking I play with these types of hands all the time. The button wants in on the limping action as well. The small blind folds, before the big blind suddenly raises to an aggravating price of 25 with a $700 stack. The low jack calls. This is a really tiny price for the number of limpers. Any real hand here should raise to like 40. I consider 3-betting just out of pure annoyance, but the big blind is pretty loose and also a bit tilted, so I don't think I'm going to get away with it with just one street, and I don't really want to commit my stack with 7-9 freaking offsuit, so I decide to just make the call. The cutoff and button both fold, which is good since it will give me position for the rest of the hand. The flop comes king, 4, 5, rainbow. We don't flop anything, not even a gut shot, but when both players check to me, I didn't call with this type of garbage hand pre-flop if I'm not going to make use of my position. So I lead with a 2/3 pot bet of 55, holding complete air. Big blind makes the call, but the low jack folds. If I had to guess, I think he's holding some sort of middling pocket pair that's better than a 5, but smaller than a king. Maybe he has a hand like 6s, 7s, or 8s. The turn brings a 9 of hearts, which I'm a huge fan of. If my opponent had a hand like 10s, I think he would have raised bigger pre-flop. But when he checks the action over, why take the risk? Why not just keep the pressure on to take down the pot without seeing a river? I continue with another 2/3 pot bet of 125. My opponent folds, so I take down a nice sized pot simply using position. Just so you know, I would have made the exact same bet regardless of if a 9 had come on the turn or not. You don't actually need a real hand if you have position and your opponent has telegraphed the strength of his hand with his smaller than average pre-flop raise and the check on the flop. We get a whole lot more diddly squat for the next hour. We're now sitting at over 2 hours into the session before we're dealt our third notable hand. Here, there's a live 10 when the +1 limps. I raise the action to 55 in the hijack with ace-king offsuit. The action folds around to the small blind, who 3-bets me to 165 with a full stack of 1500. It's our good friend French Bulldog, whom we haven't seen since vlog number 1. He's a pretty conservative player, but since we have position, I make the call. The flop comes 9, 10, 10 with 2 clubs. Frenchie continues with a hefty half-pot bet of 150. My hands are pretty tight here. He'll have an overpair nearly 100% of the time. That bet is too strong to be anything else. There's not a lot I can do here, so I just make the fold. We're now down $643, 2 hours and 15 minutes into the session. 6 minutes later, I get dealt another playable hand. Under the gun limps. +1 raises to 20. The middle position calls with a short stack of 235. I 3-bet to 80 in the small blind with pocket tens. The limper folds. The OG raiser thinks his options over for a moment before finally folding. However, the short stack shoves all in. I make the easy call, so we go to a run out that comes 9-7-2 with 1 heart and 2 diamonds. So far so good. I haven't overpaired to the board, which is great. The turn is a 5 of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board. The river brings in a 10 of hearts, giving us top set, although I highly doubt that I needed it. Our opponent tables pocket 6s, so we take down this pot. Only down $405 now, which is finally a step in the right direction. This next hand is going to be a doozy. Only 15 minutes after our last notable hand, the low jack opens to 25. That's a larger than normal open size, so with ace 10 of clubs in the hijack, I'm not going to do anything other than call. The button calls as well. The flop comes ace 6-7 rainbow with 1 club. The low jack leads for 40. That's pretty standard. He should do that with nearly 100% of his range. I'm not going anywhere with top pair and a few back doors, so I make the easy call. Unfortunately, the button also tags along as well. Okay, now this is disconcerting. It sucks to be stuck in the middle without any indication as to whether I'm good, and if I'm not, whether a 10 will actually be the nail in my coffin, in case one of my opponents is holding a hand like 8-9 suited. The turn is a 2 of hearts. With 2 callers, the jig is up for the low jack, so he starts with a check. I highly doubt I have the button beat here unless he's either on a draw or playing a suited ace with a garbage kicker, so I also check. The button makes a 60% pot size bet of 120 with about 750 behind. The low jack quickly gets out of the way. Okay, decision time. I don't think I'm good here. It's much more likely that my opponent has me outkicked as opposed to me having him outkicked. I'm not getting the right odds to call for a 3-outer. However, I know that my opponent most likely has a 1-pair type of holding. He would have raised the flop otherwise. So I decide to put in a semi-bluff to 320. I'm ripping a hand like a flop set or 2 pairs. I never want to call and pray for 3 outs when I highly suspect I'm behind. However, check raising with 3 outs as a fallback plan is much more appealing. I know that in my opponent's shoes, I'm almost always folding 1 pair to a check raise unless I have a really good read on my opponent. I'm sitting here trying to telepathically convey the message, just fold, man. It's not worth it. You only have 1 pair, dude. I know you have 1 pair. You know you have 1 pair. Just let it go, brother.
Do it!
I hadn't made a bluff that anyone has seen all night. Heck, I haven't hardly played anything all night. Unfortunately, my pleas fall on deaf ears as my opponent makes the call in barely over 10 seconds. Damn it. Time for plan B. Now I need to telepathically convince the deck to obey.
Do it.
Give me a freaking 10, man. You owe it to me. You've been screwing me over all freaking night. Just 1 damn 10. Please, please, brother.
Help me! Help me!
I have a family to feed and a very terrifying, albeit short wife. Come on, man. 1 time. So when the river puts out a 10 of spades, I immediately ship my stack in for my opponent's remaining 550. Phew! I love it when a plan comes together.
You bet he does.
My opponent goes into the blender. He's sitting there agonizing. So now I'm sitting there thinking, aw, come on, dude. You called 320 on the turn. What did you seriously expect would happen on the river? You can't call a turn bet of that magnitude if you weren't planning on calling the river. Did you seriously call the turn bet hoping to hit your 3 outs with plans of folding if you didn't? Come on, man. Just put the money in. I got 2 kids to feed, bro. After 45 seconds, my opponent sees the logic in my telepathic message, and he finally decides to make the call. I show him that I'm a river rat, and he flips over ace-king offsuit in disgust. Okay, so I don't advise that you guys ever slow play 1 pair. Had my opponent 3-bet pre-flop, or just raised on the flop, I would have just let my hand go. Or, if he thought he was ahead on the turn, he should have just shipped it. I would have folded then too. Thankfully, he played exactly how he did to allow me to scoop this pot. Only a few hands later, we're down to only 6-handed with the loss of the last opponent I busted out. Here, under the gun limps. I raised to 20 in the +1 with Jack-Queen of spades. Only the under the gun calls. The flop comes 5, 9, 10 with 2 diamonds and 1 club. We flop open-ended with 2 overs. We're almost exactly 50-50 against a hand like ace-10. Under the gun starts with a check, so I lead with a c-bet of 25. Under the gun suddenly check raises to 65, which isn't all that big of a check raise, all things considered. We have 6 clean outs to the nuts, but potentially 14 outs in total if our opponent only has a 1-pair type of holding. So this is just an easy call. The turn brings a queen of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board. We just made top pair, so when our opponent continues with another weak bet of 90, this is just an easy call. Our hand has improved significantly, but it's not strong enough to raise. The river is a deuce of diamonds, completing the front door flush. Now our opponent checks. Had we missed all of our 14 outs, I would definitely use this opportunity to make a huge bluff, but since we have massive showdown value, I just check the action back. My opponent tables 3-5 of hearts for flop bottom pair, so I scoop the pot. He was likely trying to get an ace-x type of hand to fold, but unfortunately for him, that's not what we had. With this win, I'm in the green for a respectable $745, recovering from my low point of being down nearly $650. I play for another 15 minutes and lose back a tiny bit of my winnings before the table breaks and I decide to cash out. In for $2,200 and out for $28.96 for a profit of $696 after nearly 3 hours of playtime. The tables broke quite early and often in August, but I was glad I was able to make a full recovery before that happened. If you like what you saw tonight, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. I offer free content and hand analysis from the perspective of a pro who's been around nearly 17 years, and the only thing I ask in return is to help my channel grow. Comment below anything that you liked about this episode or about my channel in general. As always, I hope to see you in the next video.